While the running back position has been completely destroyed, honestly, there are so many wide receivers that I think we can start this week. It's kind of crazy to try to fit all these guys into a top 40 list. Starting off at the top with Jefferson, Tyreek, not much to discuss. Both these guys are clear wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2. If you're looking at Justin Jefferson, he's number 2 in the NFL, only behind Puka in targets overall. We'll talk about Puka later on, of course. It's a wide receiver that's had over 300 receiving yards through the first 2 weeks. I will say his pick him on Underdog of 100 receiving yards. I'm probably going with the lower than this week, even if it's a great game environment against the Chargers. Now, going down to tier 2, I'm actually going to have CeeDee Lamb going up against the Arizona Cardinals here. If you're looking at CeeDee Lamb, this is a wide receiver that's a straight up target hog. He saw 13 targets last week in a very tough matchup going up against the New York Jets. I mean, the Dallas Cowboys have just been blowing teams out. They beat the Giants 40-0. They beat the Jets 30-10. This should be another blowout where they are playing the Cardinals, but we've seen Lamb be able to still command volume in these blowouts. Now, Monroe Brown, our next wide receiver at 4. Maybe they go through and look to throw the ball a little bit more with no David Montgomery here. Overall, this is an offense that we can assume is going to be able to effectively move the ball down the field. I mean, we saw week 1, they had 3 touchdowns against the Chiefs. We saw week 2 that they went out there and dropped 31 points on the Seahawks. And with Monroe Brown, now he's had almost back-to-back weeks as a top 5 to 10 wide receiver in fantasy. Now, Stefon Diggs will be our next guy with Diggs. They're probably going to boat race the Washington Commanders, but at the same time, you saw him boat race the Las Vegas Raiders last week, and Diggs was still completely fine, still had his 7 receptions, still had his 66 receiving yards, and this is one of the teams that has a higher implied team total than a lot of other teams this weekend. Now, Keenan Allen will probably be our biggest riser here, and of course, I will update this list later in the week, so make sure you are subscribed. This is really going to depend on what we get from Austin Ekeler. If Ekeler misses, I'm going to be all in on Keenan. I'm going to be all in on Mike Williams like we were a week ago, just because we can assume the volume goes up for the wide receivers in this offense. However, if Ekeler does play, I will say Keenan probably drops down a tier below, even if it's crazy to talk about a running back mattering that much for a wide receiver ranking. Now, going over to Devonte Adams, and we'll throw Jamar Chase in here as well. The implied team totals that you have with these wide receivers only sitting at 22 and 22.25. So overall, these wide receivers are going to be in the worst offenses out of anybody else inside the top 9 here. Now, with that being said, I think Chase can move up. It really just depends on the availability of Joe Burrow. That will be something we're having to monitor throughout the entire week. And also, we are going to have to monitor the concussion for Devonte Adams. Now, our last wide receiver in this tier will be A.J. Brown. And I understand people are worried about A.J. Brown. I hear everybody in the comments section going, oh, Mason, Devonta Smith is the wide receiver 1 here. What are you doing? In reality, if you look at the target volume, I mean, A.J. Brown has seen 16 targets. He's averaging 8 targets a game. This is pretty much the exact same thing that you saw last year. But with these big play wide receivers, naturally, you are going to have a lot of variability week to week on their actual fantasy points at the end of the day. I'm not worried about A.J. Brown at all. I mean, I think that he's still a locked and loaded top 10 wide receiver every week. Side note, I've seen some people in the live streams trading Puka for Brown. If somehow you can pull that off, please make sure you're doing so. Now, dropping over to our next tier, we will have Chris Olave. With Olave, yeah, Michael Thomas is getting volume, but it doesn't matter. Chris Olave, back-to-back weeks now with double-digit targets. I mean, he has almost 200 receiving yards so far this season. Touchdowns really haven't been there. This is a pretty bad Saints offense overall, where, I mean, right now the implied team total is only going to be at 20.25 points this next week. Now, Jalen Waddle will be our next wide receiver. The volume is not there with Jalen Waddle. He's only had 5 and 6 targets in the first 2 weeks, but the efficiency is. With Jalen Waddle, with those 11 targets, 164 total receiving yards. And this is naturally what you expect if you play alongside someone like Tyreek Hill, where Tyreek is just going to get so much defensive attention that you are naturally going to be able to be one of the most efficient wide receivers in the entire NFL. And Vegas sportsbooks are telling us that this is an elite Miami Dolphins offense going forward, where they do have an applied team total of about 27.5 points. Now, our next wide receiver will be Devonta Smith. And yeah, Smith was more productive than what you had with A.J. Brown this past week. But really, it's off the big play, right? I mean, this is going back to what we're talking about. Both these wide receivers will be very volatile on a week-to-week perspective if the volume's not going to be there. And instead, you are relying on efficiency. You've had 15 targets for Devonta Smith compared to 18 targets for A.J. Brown. I don't think we have enough data to go through and say that Smith is the official wide receiver 1 in this offense. Now, Calvin Ridley will be our next guy. Calvin Ridley, very good offense. Right now, they are favored 10 points over the Houston Texans. Ridley gave you the dud last week. But he did have 8 targets at the end of the day. So, it really was just the overall scheme that the Kansas City Chiefs had to go through and stop Ridley. Obviously, Christian Kirk, someone we'll talk about at the end of this video, did go out there and dominate. Ridley's still the alpha in this offense going forward. And now our last wide receiver in this tier will be Puka. And if you wanted to go through and rank him as high as wide receiver 10, honestly, he probably deserves to be that high because he is number 1 in the NFL right now in targets, and it is not even remotely close. He is sitting at 35 targets. The next highest guy is Justin Jefferson. It is absurd. It is unbelievable, and he has been crushing it. He is significantly better than I could have ever imagined. Now, with that being said, we are looking at a sample size of 2 games. Whereas if you look at players like Chris Olave, if you look at players like Jalen Waddle, Devonta Smith, A.J. Brown, Jamar Chase, Devonte Adams, we just have a sample size of dominance, a sample size of elite level play of at least 16 games in every one of these scenarios. So as Puka continues to go out there and dominate, and as he expands his sample size overall, he will continue to move up these rankings. Obviously, if Kupp comes back, then the story may change just a bit. We'll cover that later on. But if you wanted to go through and check out Puka, I believe last week Puka had a pick'em of about 40-ish yards on Underdog Fantasy. Interested to see where that is going to be this week. And of course, if you wanted to go out there and check out any of those pick'ems on Underdog Fantasy, you can find that link in the comment section. Find it in the description of this video. If you use promo code FLOCK on Underdog, you're going to get a 100% deposit match up to $100. You're going to be getting our updated 2023 rest of season rankings and tiers. And you will be getting a special pick'em. Daniel Jones more than less than half a total yard against the San Francisco 49ers. Side note, if you're on Underdog, please make sure you are including Tyreek Hill's pick'em this weekend. Underdog's going to be giving away $10,000 to 10 people who include that pick'em. And we actually had a couple members of the flock winning that $10,000 last week, which is so damn cool. But now our next tier is going to be led off with Mike Evans. Mike Evans obviously had the blow up last week. He had 171 yards off of 8 targets. The efficiency is going to come down. Plus, it's a toughish matchup going up against the Philadelphia Eagles team, where right now you only have about 20.5 points for the implied team total in Tampa. Now, our next wide receiver will be T. Higgins. Higgins may fall down these rankings if we have no Joe Burrow. Like we discussed previously, the Vegas line opened up as the Cincinnati Bengals 6.5-point favorites over the Rams for Monday night. But since this line has moved down to about 2 points in favor of the Cincinnati Bengals. So if Burrow misses, then obviously T. Higgins is going to have to move down these rankings. Now, Mike Williams will be our next wide receiver. Very similar situation. Phenomenal game environment. We want to get as many players in here as possible, but we are waiting on an injury. We are waiting for Eckler. If you have no Eckler, Mike Williams will probably move to the top of this tier. If Eckler does play, he'll probably move to the bottom of this tier. Now, Amari Cooper will be our next wide receiver, and Amari was not even supposed to play against Pittsburgh. Dealing with the significant groin injury. Deshaun Watson didn't look great, but Amari Cooper still posted 10 targets, still had 90 receiving yards. Obviously, we're hoping that Amari is fully healthy this next week. Should be a toughish game environment against the Tennessee Titans, but without Nick Chubb, they may have to go out there and throw the ball a little bit more than they have previously. Now, our next 2 wide receivers, we are waiting on some injury news. We have Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. With Brandon Ayuk dealing with the shoulder injury last game, I do expect that he plays Thursday against the New York Giants, but because he is dealing with that shoulder, I do think we have to give the slight edge to Deebo Samuel. If you go over and look at the pick'ems that you have currently on Underdog Fantasy, they do have Deebo Samuel sitting at about 73.5 total yards, which is funny because they only have him at 53.5 receiving yards, so they are projecting Deebo to have a considerable amount of volume as a rusher. Now, DK Metcalf will be our next guy at 21. And with Metcalf, he was a sell-high player for us after week 1. He was a guy that I wasn't really excited to draft coming into the season. And I know people are probably still going to be screaming that we have him too low. Well, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, this is a wide receiver that has had 11 targets through the first 2 games. Now, I understand. Yes, the offensive line's been banged up. Now, I understand. DK Metcalf did miss some time last game with an injury, but he was able to come back. Still, fundamentally, the volume is not there. You have a lot going to Lockett. JSN is expanding his role at the same time. This is a team that should be able to run the ball against Carolina. So I am still going to remain our stance that we are lower on DK Metcalf than the market, specifically because of the target competition in this offense. Now, George Pickens will be our next guy at 22. Pickens, he was a buy low player for us last week, and he crushed it. His underdog pick was like a 40 receiving yards. The man goes out there 127 receiving yards and the receiving touchdown. Now, the matchup against the Raiders, not great. Should be a super low scoring game environment. The implied team totals, only 21 points for George Pickens in this offense. But still, at the end of the day, you have no Deontay Johnson. No Deontay Johnson. He will be a target hog, and I think we have to rank him as a top 24 guy. Now, Tyler Lockett will be our next wide receiver. He was the guy to dominate in Seattle last week. Now, with that being said, JSN was dealing with the leg injury. With that being said, DK Metcalf, I believe, was dealing with the ribs. So I don't necessarily think that Lockett is the locked and loaded wide receiver one in Seattle going forward. Really does depend on the health of all these guys. And I think it's going to be more so a random game. I mean, one day you're going to have Tyler Lockett blowing up. The next day you're going to have DK Metcalf blowing up. The next day you're going to have Jackson Smith and Jigba blowing up. Now, Chris Godwin will be our next wide receiver at 24. With Godwin, I mean, you had everything going to Evans last week in terms of the actual production, but if you're looking at the targets, they're about the same. Chris Godwin has averaged 7 targets per game through the first 2 games so far. Like we were saying earlier with Mike Evans, so it's just a pretty tough matchup overall. Now, Michael Pittman will be our next guy at 25. With Pittman, we don't really know what it's going to be. We don't know if we have Gardner Minshew. We don't know if we have Anthony Richardson. Fundamentally, it may not matter. I mean, even if Anthony Richardson's better for the Colts, Anthony Richardson's probably going to take rushing production for himself and monopolize the fantasy points in this offense. So maybe you would even rather have Gardner Minshew in here. Should be a very bad offense, though. Their projected team total is about 18.5 points. Generally, we want to be avoiding the Colts if that's going to be the case going up against the Ravens. But Michael Pittman has had back-to-back weeks now with double-digit targets, and he was one of our most drafted wide receivers. We're getting him as like wide receiver 40 on Underdog this offseason. So pretty excited to see it. And yeah, we will finally have Garrett Wilson here. Garrett Wilson had 8 targets last week. Garrett Wilson had 83 receiving yards as well. But also with Garrett Wilson, the vast majority of this came off of 1 receiving touchdown. 1. Right now, like we were discussing last week, I mean, I still think all Jets are sells. You're not going to get anything for Breece Hall anymore. You should have done it last week. Maybe you can still get something for Garrett Wilson. If you look at implied team totals right now, the New York Jets have the lowest implied team total of any team in the NFL this week, only sitting at 17 points. So yeah, I mean, if we could go through and avoid Garrett Wilson, it is something I'm looking to do. Now, our next year will be led off with Nico Collins. And I actually owe you an apology. The Houston Texans maybe have the lowest applied team total here. They're neck and neck. With Houston, going to be a very bad offense, similar to Garrett Wilson. With Nico Collins, he has had the dominant target volume. He's had 20 targets through the first 2 weeks. Now, with that being said, I mean, you have CJ Stroud going out there and throwing the ball almost 50 times a game. Maybe you continue to get this trend. Maybe this is Blake Bortles, Allen Robinson 2015, where we can just rack up garbage time production. But, I mean, I think we can wait just a bit before we go through and confirm that that's going to be the case. Now, Michael Thomas will be our next wide receiver. Thomas looks good. Michael Thomas making highlight grabs. Michael Thomas is getting volume. He's had 17 targets. Now, Shaheed in this offense alongside Thomas and Olave is making things a little frustrating, right? I mean, if it was only Thomas and Olave, I'd be very excited to go through and rank Michael Thomas higher than this. But having a third wide receiver that's viable does make us a little bit worried. Now, our next guy will be Jerry Jeudy. With Jerry Jeudy, super disappointing last week, but it was his first week back from the hamstring. I mean, similar to how we were benching Terry McLaurin early on, I mean, as these guys get further removed from those injuries, as they get closer to 100%, the more confident we can be to put them in our starting lineup. Now, DeAndre Hopkins, our next guy at 28, he can move up these rankings as well. We're more so just going to have to continue to monitor the ankle injury with DeAndre Hopkins. We will have DJ Moore at 29. With DJ Moore, I mean, right now, I believe they're about 13.5 point dogs going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. So you may end up having the Chicago Bears being forced to throw the ball considerably, but ultimately the passing volume in this offense is not there. DJ Moore's had 9 targets so far this season. If you look at his underdog pick him on a week-to-week basis, it's like 3 receptions, 3.5 receptions. It's very hard for you to go out there and get too excited about him. Now, our last wide receiver in this tier will be Terry McLaurin. With McLaurin, I think that he will continue to improve as he is removed from the turf toe. He's currently only at 51.5 receiving yards going up against the Buffalo Bills, though, for his underdog pick'em. So generally, we would like to see a big week before we have to go through and put him in the starting lineup. Now, our next wide receiver will be Jordan Addison. I want to get Addison higher than this. I think it's going to be a beautiful game environment, and I would love to hear your opinion down in the comment section. Addison looked great last week. Obviously, you still have KJ Osborne taking some volume, though, which is a little frustrating. Can we rank Jordan Addison ahead of any of these wide receivers ahead of him? And if so, please let me know. I want to, and it seems crazy to have him this low. But going back to what we were talking about previously, running back, I mean, it's a wasteland. Running back after the first 6 guys, they're all gross. Here, wide receiver, I can go 40 deep, and I love all these players. Now, Christian Watson, that next guy. Watson, I expect to play this week. Obviously, we're going to have to monitor the practice reports. But with Watson, we're really hoping he plays, and I'm really excited to see him, what he looks like with Jordan Love. And yeah, I mean, this is a player I drafted a lot. Jordan Love looks great. He was phenomenal as a rookie. We're just going to have to monitor the hamstring. Drake London is our next player at 33. This team wants to run the ball, right? They were forced to throw it last week. I mean, they're 2-0 right now, which is very surprising. And it does look like London will be the main guy seeing targets in this offense going forward. He had the bounce back, but still not someone I want to trust because they do want to lead the NFL in rushing attempts. Now, Zay Flowers, our next guy at 34. With Zay Flowers, this is a wide receiver that you have to be a little bit hesitant on when Mark Andrews is playing. Looks like Andrews will be the dominant target here. I do want to monitor the Odell Beckham Jr. ankle injury because if Odell misses, I think we can slide Zay Flowers ahead of this. Now, Christian Kirk, we're going to have to monitor the Zay Jones injury with Kirk. He dominated with target volume last week against the Chiefs. But going back to what we saw week 1, Christian Kirk gave you literally nothing. Christian Kirk, week 1, went through and had 1 reception for 9 receiving yards. So similar to the Drake London, right? It's like, okay, well, can we believe what we just had? Then John Dotson as our last player. With Dotson, I mean, he's had 12 targets. He has 62 receiving yards on the season. Fun player, really bad offense, really bad matchup against the Bills. I felt like we had to throw his name in here, though. But I think that's all I have for you in this video. Of course, if you have not done so already, go down there, drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you want to check out any of those pick'ems on Underdog Fantasy, you can find that link in the description, find it in the comment section. Promo code FLOCK, you're going to get a 100% deposit match up to $100. Plus, you're going to get our updated top 150 rest of season rankings and tiers. And you're going to be getting a Daniel Jones special pick'em, more than less than half a total yard against the 49ers on Thursday night. But I think that's all I have for you. Again, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I really do hope you have a great day and really hope I get to see you out in a live stream later tonight.